Hi, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Martin Chandler, someone that I've known for many years and worked with in various guises. So over to you, Martin, and just tell us a bit about yourself and how you came to be a researcher in the field.
Hi, Jim. Thank you for this. So I started at Liverpool John Moores at the Centre for Public Health in 2004. I was responsible for monitoring data across needle exchange services in the northwest of England. And increasingly, we were seeing more and more anabolic steroid users presenting to needle exchanges. We were seeing increasing demand from needle exchange services for information about anabolic steroids. This was a range of drugs that they had no experience with, no training in. They were dealing with a client base who appeared to be very knowledgeable, but they didn't know if they were very knowledgeable because they had no experience around the drugs. They were a difficult group to engage with. Partly because of the stigma of drug services and partly because of the nature of the kind of presentations. They were usually kind of run in and then run out again, and then you wouldn't see them again for another 3 or 4 weeks, as opposed to opiate and stimulant injectors that you might see several times a week or a day even. So there was a lot of challenges. There was a lot of conversation about that. There was your work around anabolic steroids at the time, and some other colleagues, and I'd been involved in weight training, well, kind of from my undergraduate days, really, towards the end of my undergraduate days, and more especially through my master's degree. And through both of those, particularly in my kind of undergraduate days, I was quite keen on trying every supplement that was advertised. And at the time, internet resources weren't quite as well developed as they are now, which shows how old I am. We did have Google. I'm not that old, but the great majority of the information came through Men's Health and bodybuilding magazines and advertising and stuff like that. I bought a whole bunch of things, and predictably, almost none of it worked. But even so, like the supplement market was a very kind of underground thing at that point in a lot of ways. There was absolutely no way you'd see whey protein in Tesco's or Sainsbury's or something like that. And now you can walk into Boots, high street supermarkets, things like that. You've got a whole aisle full of sports supplement products. So it's the whole area has grown hugely. So from the perspective of somebody who was strength training and was kind of involved in that world, it was fascinating to explore the range of things that were on offer, whether or not they were actually any good, which for the most part is no. Why people use them, how people kind of move into using progressively more fringe, for better term, substances, and looking at ways of engaging with I suppose a group that traditional drug services didn't really understand because they were so completely different to the normal client base.
I think at that time as well, you got in contact and involved with a number of forums as well, which brought you, I suppose, in contact with different ends of the spectrum, where there were ones within the needle and syringe programs. We largely didn't know what they were doing, a lot of the clients there, through to, I suppose, the enhanced bodybuilders on the forums. So you're seeing the full range and hearing the different views of people, which must have been interesting.
Yeah, the forum. See, this was another change. So although there were kind of forums around when I first started, they were again, they weren't as advanced and developed as they've become over the past sort of 20 years. And going onto forums I was going onto those forums partly because it was just an interesting place to be. It was just interesting conversations to have. There was a lot of conversation about training methods, and just kind of general gym talk, which I was interested in anyway. And then moving into the ones where there was a bit more focus on the use of anabolic steroids, it was watching the exchange of information between some people who clearly knew what they were talking about, some people who sounded like they knew what they were talking about, but it was questionable, and a whole bunch of people who clearly had no idea what they were talking about, but sounded like they did. And that turns into a real melting point of Chinese whispers. Like, you get a lot of good information lost in a sea of noise, and you get a lot of bad information that just goes everywhere and becomes true because lots of people say it.
Yeah, and I suppose during that time, I mean, what sort of changes have we seen in relation to the drugs that are being used, dosages, regimes? You know, in the last 15 years, what would you say are the key differences?
See, this is a question that comes up in this field quite a lot, and the evidence base around it is scant at the moment. There are a few papers that kind of explore it, but I would say there would appear to be an increase in kind of average doses that people are using. I do get a sense that in more recent years the curve is kind of spreading out a bit more. I think there are some people who are becoming more health focused or health knowledgeable in relation to steroid use, and are perhaps moderating their use a little. But at the same time, we're also seeing other people who are on things like blast and cruise, which certainly seems to be more prevalent now. So blast and cruise being,
because you were one of the first academics to write about blast and cruise. You know, obviously it was, you know, been discussed for a long time within the forums and that, but yours was one of the first papers to bring that up.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea, the idea of I'm just going to be on for an extended period of time. I'm going to use a bodybuilding dose for X number of weeks, and then I'm going to use, they refer to it as, well, it depends on the forum, depends who you're talking to. So there'll be like a bridging cycle, or a TRT, a testosterone replacement therapy cycle. But the kind of doses that they're using are typically sort of between 100 and 200 milligrams a week, which is still vastly more than you produce naturally. So it's just a very low dose steroid cycle, and it can still involve the same kind of complex polypharmacy that you see in the main blast cycle. So really it's just taking your hormone levels up and down, but still kind of supercharging it.
But it's almost like an honest approach that say, like, I'm writing off returning to normal hormonal production, and if I need to go on to TRT, so be it. You know, so in that respect, it's.
It is. I mean, for I think for a lot of people, it very much is. Well, I've made the decision. I'm just going to plunge in both feet first and just go for it, and that's it. Kind of fully commit to that lifestyle. For some people, it's seen as a kind of shortcut to the gains they want. But I think a lot of people doing blast and cruise have basically just they recognise that there are enhanced health risks with adopting that lifestyle, but they're prepared to just go for it.
If you can just go back to one of the points you made around dosages, and of course, with the illicit market, how it is, we never really know what dosage people are taking. I mean, and I suppose in relation to the change in legislation that we saw, what, 10 years ago, what difference has that made to the market in the UK?
So stops people from importing stuff online. You can't order stuff from the Balkans and have it posted to you legally without an importation license. You can go somewhere and buy anabolic steroids if they're legal in that country, and you can bring them back if you have a quantity that you could get away with for personal use, which is itself a bit of a grey area. It's not kind of very well defined. Well, it's not defined at all.
So the legislation says get away with, does it?
Yeah. That's the exact phrase they use, actually. Just like bag up as much as you can get away with, and if you can get through customs, you're fine. The problem with that approach is that it encourages, well, as we said at the time, that it was likely to lead to an increase in underground laboratories. So essentially people making it themselves here rather than buying it in, or homebrew. So people making it at home themselves for their own use. There's certainly been an increase in discussions around homebrew where people buy in the raw powders and then make up the injectable solution themselves, because the process isn't hugely complicated, and you don't need particularly advanced equipment to be able to do it. You do need to be careful because it's very easy to get very wrong, particularly with particularly around kind of issues of sterility, but it's not a complicated thing to do. And we saw, an increase in underground labs. We saw some underground labs gaining prominence. We saw new underground labs springing up. We saw underground labs having their products faked by other underground labs. And some of this was anecdotal because we couldn't get hold of products to test them, but there was this idea that somebody would fake another underground lab's products, make a poorer quality product in order to discredit that lab, and then bring in their own product and say, look, these are better. Or alternatively, just ride on the success of another underground lab, just copy their labels, make their own gear, stick the label on and sell it, and just make money out of somebody else's brand success. And we also saw the advent of things like frog juice. I don't know if you remember the frog juice thing going on for a while. So frog juice was came out. It was purported to have amazing fat burning properties and possibly anabolic properties, depending who you spoke to, but nobody knew what was in it. And the people who were making it refused to tell anybody what was in it. But it produced a lot of really interesting discussions on forums where people were saying, all it says is frog juice. I'm not going to inject myself with something where I can't see what the ingredients are. But then other, particularly more experienced users would say, well, we're already injecting ourselves with stuff where we don't know what's in it, even though it says, trenbolone or testananthate or whatever on the label. We don't know that that's what's in it. We just take it as read. So somebody stuck a label on something, we don't know what's in it, but we're still going to inject it. It's really no different. You just feel different a bit about it because it doesn't have a word you recognize or you feel comfortable with. But it proved quite popular for a while. I think I've got a feeling it's still around somewhere, although perhaps not quite as popular as it was.
And during that time, we saw Milanan come onto the scene.
Yeah. Now, Milanan was an interesting one. The first I heard of Milanan was when a needle exchange contacted us because they heard about it for the first time when an anabolic steroid injector had brought his girlfriend into the service to talk to the needle exchange workers, because he hadn't realized that she was using Milanan, and more importantly, that she was sharing the injecting equipment with half a dozen of her mates. And she complained about the idea, about the fact that the injections were getting painful. It turned out they'd been using the same seed needle and same syringe amongst half a dozen of them or so for like 3 weeks at this point. So the needle must have looked like a fish hook at this point. But that prompted us to start asking around whether or not other services were seeing it. We saw more and more people saying, yeah, more and more people coming in using it. But it included some groups that we hadn't seen in harm reduction services before. There was occasional stories coming through of things like a woman who turned up at a needle exchange with her daughter. Her daughter was still in school uniform, so like she'd literally collected her from school, gone to a needle exchange to pick up injecting equipment for both of them to use Milanan on the grounds that it was only a tanning injection, so it's probably safe. Which is, but then you've got a whole bunch of new people who have stepped over that line into buying something unknown off the internet and injecting themselves with it and thinking that's okay, that's fine, and being perfectly okay with going to a drug service to collect the equipment. So yeah, Milanan was an interesting, even though there are now some licensed analogues of Milanan which are being used therapeutically or starting to be used therapeutically. The original formulations of Milanan 1 and 2, which are not licensed anywhere, because there were problems with them throughout the trials and they needed further refinement. The Milanans are still more popular than the licensed versions that have come out since then.
I mean, what puts you in, I suppose, an unusual position is another aspect of your work is doing the expert witness, and so you've seen a number of cases and seen it from different perspectives around how things are working. What are the range of sort of cases that you've worked on?
So the expert witness work has proved fascinating, really. Generally speaking, I get one or two types of case. They're both very similar. They're just they have a slightly different emphasis depending on who contacts me first, whether it's the defendant's solicitor or the police. Now, the role of an expert witness is you are there to provide court with information and to clarify technical matters for the court, regardless of who it is that's employed you. So it doesn't matter whether it's the police or the defence who have enlisted my services. I have to write the report based on whatever information they give me. Generally speaking, the most common ones are issues around quantities. People have been arrested with a quantity of anabolic steroids, and the police aren't sure whether or not it's could be considered for personal use because it's not defined in the legislation. So what they see is as a lot, I might look at and say, well, that's enough for 2 cycles, and it makes sense to kind of buy it in bulk like that. This doesn't look like the amount I would expect to see for a supplier, because of course personal use is legal. Supply, distribution, importation without a license is illegal. And then sometimes I'll get a case where, yeah, okay, it's quite clearly it's supply because somebody's got 20,000 dianabol. With the best will in the world, nobody's bought that for their own personal use. The other kind of cases that I occasionally get larger scale manufacturer or supply cases when they tend to just want to know more about the production process and the kind of distribution channels and costs and things like that. Probably the biggest one there for me is the cost, because they invariably overestimate how much it's all actually worth. And then finally, I've only had a couple of these. And these tend to come from defense solicitors rather than from the police. Cases involving, or supposedly involving, roid rage. So the idea that somebody has become violent because they're using anabolic steroids, and they want an expert to either come along and say, yes, this person clearly lost their mind because they were using anabolic steroids, or alternatively, this person clearly didn't lose their mind because of anabolic steroids. It's all fine, then they're not a psychopath. And those are quite difficult to deal with, because A, we don't have an evidence base to be able to say much there. We know it might happen in some people in some cases, but
so you get paid for saying, well, it's hard to say, really.
Essentially, yeah. Essentially, I get paid to say we don't have an evidence base that absolutely draws a causal link between these two things in all people, and that evidence base will never exist. And generally speaking, you can point to other things in the case, like long history of drinking, or a whole bunch of other things. Often in cases like that, things like heavy alcohol use get overlooked. And people focus on the anabolic steroids, so then you have to kind of pull their attention back to the other stuff that's going on in this case.
Or the cocaine.
Yeah, heavy cocaine use, alcohol use, things like that. But one thing that kind of comes out through all of these cases is the complete lack of knowledge in the criminal justice system around what anabolic steroids and associated image and performance enhancing drugs actually are, who uses them, how they use them. There is a lot of almost like a systematic acceptance of the mythology around it, like roid rage. Like if you use steroids, you're automatically going to get big. Like that's it. You inject some gear and that's it. Next week you'll look like Arnold Schwarzenegger. That seems to be a kind of underlying basis for a lot of the decision making that they do, until they turn to somebody like me or one of the other people doing the expert witness work, and who then point out that it doesn't really work like that.
There's one final thing I wanted to ask you about, and I mean, it's clear talking to you about the tensions between, I suppose, the health agenda and the criminal justice agenda. But in your case with your PhD, you've got a third factor thrown in there, which is sport.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about your PhD and how you're negotiating different tensions, really.
Thankfully, in my particular case, the tensions aren't that much of an issue. There is the potential for some work for those tensions to come into play. So my PhD is I'm essentially exploring theoretical underpinnings for how people move from supplement use to doping. Whether or not it's similar to the gateway theory approach, which is still quite prevalent in some areas of doping research, despite having been largely thrown out by the world of psychoactive drugs quite some time ago, because it's nonsense. Just setting my stall out. So kind of exploring a more functional approach to how people develop kind of the use of doping products. But yeah, so the tensions are, I'm a hardline harm reductionist. As far as I'm concerned, drug prohibition is and always has been an utterly terrible idea. It doesn't work. it demonstrably doesn't work, and causes more problems than it will ever solve. Well, because it won't solve any problems. I am most certainly in favour of the idea of decriminalisation of recreational drugs, and addressing the health and human needs of people with problematic drug use as a way of dealing with their issues, rather than putting them in jail, which does absolutely nothing for anybody, and in doing so completely ignores all the stuff that led them to problematic drug use in the first place. So harm reduction, so the kind of health agenda, the idea of harm reduction, is all about supporting the human. The criminal justice system is all about, are we going to let you do this or are we not? It's a very black and white thing, and people who are experiencing problematic drug use don't live in a black and white world. They just don't. It's not that simple. So legislation is always going to struggle to deal with that. In sport, there's a whole other issue. So whilst I'm a confirmed harm reductionist, I would not support, as some people have called for, the idea of allowing drugs in sport. And the reason I wouldn't support it in that arena is because we have seen, you go back to the East German doping scandal, many, many years ago, or even some of the more recent doping scandals. Athletes being treated with image and performance enhancing drugs without knowing that that's what was happening, or in a situation where they didn't feel like they could raise their voice against that because their coach was telling them you have to do this, team captain was telling them you have to do this, and in that kind of atmosphere, the difference between that use of iPads and, say, bodybuilders, particularly recreational, non-competitive bodybuilders, is that they are self-directed use. Whereas in sport, you can end up with people who are using those drugs without wanting to, or perhaps without being aware of it. Obviously, there are athletes who are fully aware of what they're doing and fully intending to cheat, but that's not all of them. I think opening the door to essentially, I think if we allow drugs in sport, what we do is we open the door to pharmaceutical companies coming, and we can make a lot of money here because there's a lot of money in sport, and that's always a recipe for disaster where humans are concerned. I wouldn't want to see a situation where we end up with a lot of chemical athletes, which is, I think, what would happen. But at the same time, I would like to see more of the principles of harm reduction being introduced into anti-doping. Taking a purely drug prohibition approach, I don't think is realistic or helpful. It misses the nuance of human beings and the decision processes they make. The idea that you can lump lots of human beings together and say, it's as ridiculous as me saying all heroin injectors are injecting heroin because they've had a childhood trauma. Quite a lot of them have. Some of them haven't. Some of them just tried heroin and then got lost in it. But and then in amongst that, there are myriad other reasons why they may be where they are with problematic drug use. You cannot treat them all just like, boom, opiate injections, blah. So there are the potential for tensions between those two things, and at the moment, the work I'm doing at the moment is I think I'm hoping we'll be able to contribute to the idea of seeing that development as something that is a decision-making process by humans, but also some of the stuff that's coming out of my PhD is the lack of education and training around nutrition and supplement use, even at national level. So if there's the alternatives or training around the alternatives are lacking, and you're letting people rely on Instagram and on social media for information sources, you can't be too surprised when these things are a bit crazy, maybe.
Thank you very much for those points, which I'm sure there'll be responses to some of the things that you said, and that's what we need. We need further discussion. So thanks very much for your time, Martin. Cheers.
Thank you, Jim.